Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 25. Today we'll discuss strengthening your argument through warrants. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need a document to write on, as well as access to your Project 3, your annotated bibliography materials. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll examine the specific role of warrants in argument-based academic writing. We'll explore the structure of warrant composition, and we'll understand the importance of developing clear warrants in argument-based academic writing. All right, so we actually gained some familiarity with the term warrant as it functions in academic writing a few core lectures ago when we looked at the larger components of an academic argument. But warrants, I think, call for special attention. When we think about warrant, like I said, this week feels kind of like a crime drama, police procedural type show week to me. Like I said, in the previous core lecture, we talked about evidence. Now we're talking about warrants. So what a warrant does, a lot of the time we think of that term, we may think, Fourth Amendment, come back with a warrant, like a search warrant, if you will. But when we think about it in terms of academic writing, yeah, it kind of serves the same function in that warrants can help us make sense of data, help us make sense of information as it applies to our own arguments. So when we think about it through the lens of academic writing, and I love this description from Vanderbilt University, it basically, a warrant interprets the data and shows how it supports your claim. So another way to think about a warrant is the connection you make between your original argument and the evidence you're citing to support that argument. I like to visualize it as a bridge and helping the audience or your reader understand how you got from point A to point B. Another thing, another way we can think about warrants is much like we include the reasons. So recall back actually to that core lecture where we discussed the components of an argument. Much as we incorporate specific reasons to answer the why question, so why do you support this argument? Well, because reasons 1, 2, and 3. The warrant does a very similar thing for why we have introduced specific bits of evidence. So a warrant helps us to basically say to our audience, okay, this is why this evidence matters, and this is why I included it. Because much like when your reader first interacts with your thesis, they'll say, okay, well, why? And you follow up with your reasons, of course, which you use to unpack that thesis throughout the 10 to 12 pages you'll write. Again, the warrant does something very similar for your audience. So if they engage with a source in which you've summarized, paraphrased, or included a direct quote of, your audience will more than likely think, okay, well, why did they include this? Why did they cite this specific study? How do they see it as relevant or important or persuasive to the argument that I have been reading about in greater detail? So the warrant helps you answer those questions your reader will ultimately have in your own words. So when we think about the value of a warrant, so why do we even include it? As a writer, I've seen both students and professional writers, really writers of all skill level, who will introduce a source and say, oh, so-and-so says this, and then there's nothing else. The paragraph will end with, something that a source has said, and there's really no discussion on why it was included. And so I, as the reader, am sort of left to draw my own conclusions as to why it was that piece of evidence or that source was cited and discussed. What a warrant does, though, and why I think they're so important regardless of what you're writing, is it helps kind of restore the power and the control of the argument back to you as the writer. So it does this in a few different ways. It allows you to connect your ideas to the evidence in your own words. So it allows you to basically answer that question of, here's why this is important to my argument. Remember, the sources that you include might not be directly applicable or aligned perfectly with the argument you're making. So for example, let's say you're writing about a school policy in St. George, right? But you found a piece that talks about similar things, but it's coming out of Texas or it's coming out of a school district from Alabama. Of course, are Texas and Alabama exactly like St. George, Utah? No, but there are enough similarities there to where your audience can make, where you can present those similarities to say, look, obviously this is what this school district in Texas or Alabama found. We can make reasonable connections to what's going on in St. George. It gives you the opportunity as the writer to make those connections in your own words and to really localize it to the argument that you're trying to make and the reasons you're providing to support that. Also, what a warrant does is it helps ensure that your readers understand the connection in the way you as the writer intend. So as I said, I've read written works by writers of all experience and skill levels where they'll just leave it, say, here's a direct quote by someone, or here's me summarizing this article. And I, as the reader, am saying, okay, well, what am I supposed to do with this? How do you want me to understand this? I'm not quite sure how you see it relevant because there's no follow-up discussion from the writer. But when writers do include those thoughtful warrants, I can say, okay, this is how you want me as the reader to understand this evidence or this source that you have included to support your thesis or to support your reasons. So it helps you as the writer ensure that your reader understands the source or the bit of evidence in the way that you want them to. And what that also does for the reader is it helps avoid confusion. There have been times, of course, when warrants aren't provided that I'll find myself saying, oh, that's how you understood that piece. I took it a completely different direction. And then I have to spend additional time tracing back that argument, how I understood it. And, for me as the reader, it takes a lot more time and a lot more energy than perhaps it should. And there are times where I'm like, okay, well, I really don't have time to go back and reconsider this. And then I can't really do anything with that argument that I've just engaged with. So a warrant allows the reader to stay on the same page as you as the writer and how you want to develop the argument and how you want the reader to engage with that topic. Also, what's so important about a warrant is that it helps you make sure that your voice remains dominant and not your sources. That is such a tricky thing with academic writing. Again, to writers of all experiences and skill levels, sometimes we get so caught up in showing that, hey, other people think similarly. Here's one source, here's another. Let's just pile them on to the point where the writer's voice becomes lost and it just kind of becomes this sea of information and we're just going from one source to the next and there isn't really a lot of the writer's own voice threading us through those sources and how they're relevant for supporting the writer's argument. So by including those warrants, it gives you the opportunity to say, yes, here's what someone else is saying, but it focuses the attention back on you and your argument and redirects your reader's attention from saying, oh, hey, this is actually a cool study or a fascinating bit of information that we are seeing from a school district in Texas or Alabama, to saying, oh, yeah, and this is why it's relevant to the school system in St. George, Utah. So what a warrant does is it not only allows you to make sure that your audience understands the evidence or the sources in the way that you want them to, but it also helps ensure that your argument, your thoughts, your responses to this topic remain the star focus of your reader's attention, and it helps them really recenter back to what you are saying, so they can consider your argument and not the arguments of the sources that you incorporate. When we think about developing warrants, and when we think about their structure and their presence in academic writing, warrants should immediately follow your citation of a source. So after you include that end parenthetical citation, or you have finished your direct quote, your paraphrase, your summary, you immediately want to follow up with saying, okay, this is the source that I just included. This is how it's relevant to the point that I'm trying to make. This is why I included it. This is what I think it speaks to and how I think it supports this specific reason that supports my overall thesis. So keeping in mind that once you've cited a source, once you've incorporated into your own writing, you immediately follow up with that warrant and start discussing in your own words why you believe it's relevant. Now, when you're developing those warrants, it's important to keep in mind, again, I'm going back to Vanderbilt University because they have a solid wealth of information on warrants. They say that a good warrant will or may be a reasonable interpretation of the facts. So, like I mentioned with the evidence in the previous core lecture, we have a responsibility to our sources to make sure that we're representing them correctly. And in the warrant, when we develop warrants, there might be a tendency there to say, okay, well, I've represented my sources fairly, in the summary, in the paraphrase, in the direct quote, but then we might blow it out of proportion or put words in the author's mouth in our warrants in saying, okay, well, this is what this source means and how it's relevant. You always want to remember that a good warrant, it doesn't pull anything out of left field. Rather, the audience should be able to say, oh, okay, I understand now why specifically you included this source. Going hand in hand with that, it doesn't make, a good warrant does not make illogical interpretive leaps. So basically, again, you're not putting words in the source's mouth just to try and make some semblance of a connection to your own argument. It also does not assume more than the evidence supports. And then also, of course, a good warrant may consider and respond to possible counter arguments, which you'll do in Project 4. So keeping those sort of 4 components in mind, let's look at what a warrant might actually look like in academic writing. So let's say I am making the overall argument. This is what my 10 to 12 page civic engagement argument focuses on. This thesis that reads, all abled Americans over the age of 18 should be required to serve in one branch of the U.S. military for at least 2 years. Okay, so that is the main overall argument that I'm going to develop reasons around and that I'm going to take the next 10 to 12 pages to convince my readers of. So in order to support that thesis, let's say at one point in the paper, I introduced this bit of evidence. Recent studies conducted by the Swiss government, a country which does mandate citizens to serve in the military, reported that requiring service allowed citizens to develop key professional skills. So if I'm reading that, I'm like, I might, as the reader might find myself saying, oh, now we're talking about professionalization and the military. That's interesting. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to sort of situate that, but then along comes the warrant, and that becomes all the more clear to me as the reader. So perhaps a follow-up warrant that's immediately going to follow my evidence would read, this study indicates that required military service not only benefits the country's domestic and foreign engagements through a larger body of servicemen and women, but it also shows that those who do participate in required military service are able to develop skills that will help them personally and professionally after their service has ended. So we have made this connection to say, hey, listen, not only is this helpful for, enacting foreign and domestic policies that the military would be involved with, and that it would be helpful if we had more people, but it also serves a benefit to those once they are out of the military. It helps them become, better leaders. It helps them become better professionals, engage in the workplace more effectively. And so I, as the reader, know to say, okay, this is why the writer was talking about, this why they cited the Swiss government to say, hey, there are benefits just beyond what immediately serves the country. There are benefits to the individual as well, which you can see circles back to they should, all abled Americans over the age of 18 should be required to serve in one branch of the U.S. military for at least 2 years. So what we've done is we've been able to say, here's my argument. Here's a piece of evidence, and here's how I see that evidence via my warrant supporting my overall thesis. Okay, lecture assignment. Here's what I would like you to do. I would like you to review the sources or evidence you plan to use to support your thesis and project for the civic engagement argument. Now, this is where your Project 3 materials are going to come in handy. Because of course I imagine many of you are probably going to use your Project 3 materials to help you develop and support your argument for Project 4. But of course, if you found another piece of evidence or another source that you'd like to use, you can certainly do that as well. I'd like you to select one scholarly source and compose a brief write-up that reflects how you would integrate that source into your own writing. So what I'm really looking for here is, do you see yourself summarizing this? And if you do, compose a summary. Do you see yourself using a direct quote from this source? If so, include the direct source. Do you see yourself paraphrasing that source? And if so, paraphrase. So you're starting to see how you can use content from at least this lecture assignment and hopefully the one from the past, and seeing how you can actually use it in your Project 4 draft. So after you've done that, after you have summarized, used a direct quote, or paraphrased the source that you have selected, compose a warrant that helps your audience understand the relevance of the source to your own argument. So after you've concluded, the summary, direct quote, or paraphrase, say, okay, this is how it's relevant. This is how it supports the overall thesis that I am making, or the overall argument that I am making. So that is that for Core Lecture 25. Be sure to include your summary and lecture assignment in your Week 13 homework submission. Overall, though, your Week 13 homework submission should include the summaries and lecture assignments for Core Lectures 24 and 25, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And all of that is due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, April 7th. If you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.